Throughout history, significant numbers of people have vanished under strange reasons. In most situations, some explanation for what happened is finally accepted. But for a select few, the facts are so unfathomable that no plausible hypothesis has ever been agreed upon in this story. We investigate one such event, the village that disappeared. When Joe Lale placed the last of the stuff into his canoe and set off downstream, the sun had barely risen. While the previous evening had been frigid, this November was far milder than many others he had encountered throughout his years trapping in Canada's Northwest Territories. Instead of the cold temperatures, it was the lack of nutrition that drove him on the next part of his trek. This journey into the bush had so far yielded little in terms of bounty for the experienced hunter, with few opportunities to supplement his existing supplies. Fortunately, earlier trips had taught him that there was a friendly Inuit hamlet only a little further down the shores of Lake Anjikuni, and he knew they would accept the furs he had managed to gather in exchange for food and supplies. After an hour of journeying, Label noticed a small plume of dark gray smoke snaking up into the sky from the shoreline with a wry smile. He changed his trajectory and began paddling towards the little group of sheds and huts that appeared shortly later. His canoe made touch with the icy coastline, and the trapper entered the village. The lack of activity did not initially concern Lale. It was still early in the day, and it was possible that the majority of the village's inhabitants were out hunting away from the settlement, but it quickly became clear that every single structure was completely empty. Fires were still burning, and newly prepared food was left out for the residents to cook. There was no trace. Perplexed, the Bell decided to examine deeper. On the outskirts, he discovered the bones of the village's huskies, all of which appeared to have died due to hunger. More concerning, the graves of the people's deceased relatives had been dug up, leaving empty spaces where the burial remains should have been. With an uneasy sensation developing in his stomach, the trapper began to evaluate his next action. As the day continued, he found no clues as to what had happened to the people or when they were expected to return, despite the fact that precious hours of daylight were fading. The Bell did not love the notion of traveling through the night, and he did not want to spend an evening in the desolate village. So he began gathering as much food as he could carry as the skies darkened. The hunter hastily returned to his canoe and cast off. As he entered the main channel, he turned over his shoulder for one final sight of the abandoned hamlet, which now appeared to be illuminated by a peculiar bluish radiance radiating from somewhere beyond the horizon. Leo grunted and began paddling faster, determined to put as much space between himself and the uncomfortable picture as possible before darkness compelled him to halt and set up camp once more. In the first week of January 1931, a small group of Royal Canadian Mounted Police troopers left their barracks in Manitoba and embarked on a difficult 560-mile journey across the prairie to Lake Anjiku. They were headed by Sergeant J. Nelson and had been patched in response to a jumbled and unclear communication that had arrived at their outpost many weeks prior to the trip. The journey was long and difficult, but it went quite smoothly until the Mounties arrived at their goal. To assess the legitimacy of Joe La Belle's perplexing communication, Nelson directed his soldiers to undertake discreet questions with any hunters or local tribesmen they encountered along the road. Their inquiries first took them to a local hospital, where Satch, an Inuit trapper, was suffering from severe frostbite. He had been discovered by another pair of hunters, alone and unconscious, lying in a snowdrift with his legs so badly frozen that he had yet to regain feeling. The constables questioned him extensively, but aside from a few heated remarks about an evil spirit known as Torn Roth, they could make little sense of his answers. After failing to glean any meaningful information from the hunter, the Mounties were routed to an Innu settlement around 150 miles from their goal. It was alleged that the tribe there had adopted a 10-year-old boy who had wandered into the settlement one evening in the middle of a snowstorm, which occurred 2 months before the village elders confirmed this to be the truth, adding that the child had not spoken a word since his arrival and that none of the surrounding tribes had any idea where he came from. But it was the testimony of a local trapper, Armand Luron, that most troubled Nelson the hunter, who explained that on one occasion, They noticed a gigantic cylindrical object hovering over them, which had turned into a bullet-like shape before flying away at high speed towards Lake Anjikuni. The party eventually arrived at their destination, which was nearly identical to what Joel Lael had described. The village was small, with a population estimated to be no more than 30 people, and was absolutely empty when they arrived, prompting his soldiers to split out and begin exploring the perimeter. Nelson continued alone into the village center, taking notes. As he went between the deserted huts, he noticed the leftovers of abandoned dinners, rotten and welded to the sides of their cooking pots, the fires underneath them long since extinguished. Inside one of the constructions was a child's coat that appeared to have been abandoned midway through its repair with a needle and thread. The huskies' frozen bodies were also found exactly where LaBelle had described them, as skeletal owing to obvious hunger. Nelson joined his officers at the village's burial place, where he discovered many empty depressions in the ground, each roughly the length and depth of a grave. The ice around these holes was still frozen hard and smooth, with no evidence that they had been scooped out by hand or tool. The headstones were carefully arranged in two piles adjacent, as if to refute any natural or animal predation. After several hours in the village, Nelson returned his troops to their horses and embarked on the long trek home. When he returned to Manitoba, he stated that he had found nothing noteworthy in the village. He could not explain how or why the inhabitants had fled, nor could he find any evidence of criminal behavior. Nelson did see, though, that Lael did not appear to be as experienced a hunter as he had claimed, having only applied for his first trapping license the previous year. He had also sold his account to the Halifax Herald, a local newspaper known for its exaggerated stories and incorrect journalism, after his report was filed. Nelson resumed his usual activities, and no more formal investigation into the matter occurred. While Sergeant Nelson's report and inquiry are as thorough as can be expected given the limited resources at his disposal, they provide no insight into the fate of the missing villagers. His results differ little from Joe Lael's first narrative and provide no significant explanation for the disappearances other than the fact that they were not criminal acts. The fact that fires were still blazing in the village when Lael arrived suggests that whatever happened was recent. There were no evident indicators of a disturbance or altercation. It appeared that the people who lived there had simply stopped what they were doing and walked away from the village en masse, leaving their sleds and kayaks behind. But this scenario does not explain why they had left their huskies or why these animals had not been fed in some time and had not eaten any of the food or supplies that were now lying unattended. It also does not explain why the bodies of the deceased villagers were removed. Interfering with the remains of a departed loved one was considered the height of disrespect to the Inuit people, and the graves did not appear to have been unearthed using any known manner. Sergeant Nelson's observation that Lael had only recently applied for a trapping license does not necessarily imply deception. It is more possible that he had spent many years operating without one before being pushed by the authorities to obtain one. His story is also not particularly representative of someone who spins fantastic tales. It was supported by the findings of the later police inquiry, which revealed no embellishments or exaggerations. So, what might explain the abrupt and unexpected disappearance of 30 persons from their houses, leaving very little evidence? Very few sensible explanations can be found. It is probable that the inhabitants will abandon the safety of their settlement for fear of some impending tragedy, such as a disease or the threat of violence from a neighboring community, which appears highly unlikely. It is easy to dismiss Armand Luron's claims of mysterious lights in the sky as simply the aurora borealis. But this does not explain the mysterious flying craft he and his sons described to the investigating officers. As an experienced hunter and trapper, he would have been well aware of the northern lights and whether anything unusual was happening in the skies above. For many years following the incident, reports circulated that the Mounties had observed mysterious blue lights stalking them from above on their voyage, but that the RCMP had instructed the detachment members to keep quiet about what they had seen. Could the missing be due to alien abduction? A passing extraterrestrial craft transported the people and their dead out of the hamlet. And how should we interpret the evidence of Sak, the injured Inuit hunter? He detailed to the officers a malevolent spirit from Inuit tradition. This creature was a gigantic man with large tusks protruding from the sides of his jaw, and it is thought to have the capacity to control nature and create devastating and scary snowstorms. For many years, different monsters have been mentioned as living undisturbed in the vast and undiscovered territories of North America. Sasquatches, enormous humanoids, and scary dinosaur-like animals live in waters like Lake Anjikuni. Could the creature, the Inuit dubbed Torn Rock, be another addition to this increasing list of bizarre beings? There are also suggestions that the region contains a number of rifts or breaks between dimensions. Over time, a considerable number of aircraft and ships have gone missing, with some claiming that they and their people vanished due to flaws that separate our reality from surrounding ones. The story of the missing Inuit village has been revisited by various authors over the years, and the RCMP has been asked to provide more detail about their investigation. They maintain that no crime occurred and that the story is, at best, an exaggeration and, at worst, a deliberately staged fabrication. Examining the numerous reports surrounding the occurrence appears to lend some weight to this theory, as several embellishments from LaBelle's account appear to have been added by subsequent publications after the original newspaper piece was published in 1930. In some cases, the number of graves disturbed differs from others. The nature of the structures Leal encountered has been revised, with the idea that they were tents rather than permanent buildings. If Leal's observation of improvised accommodations near the lake's edge was accurate, it would provide a more plausible explanation for the incident. What he discovered could have been the ruins of a seasonal or transitory camp, with the occupant merely moving on to a new or permanent settlement elsewhere in pursuit of money for his narrative. Perhaps the trapper exaggerated the encounter or staged portions of it for the Mounties to discover. As with many of the situations we have investigated, it is unlikely that the truth will ever be revealed. Too much time has passed, and there is no evident source from which further evidence may be obtained. This story, like so many others that have occurred in the Canadian bush, will stay unsolved. Oh, be time, beautiful PE.